The sound of my phone ringing in the middle of the night didn't just wake me, it jolted me straight into dread. I remember blinking into the darkness, my heart already pounding before my mind had even caught up. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 12:14 in the morning in harsh red numbers. Too late for casual calls. Too early for anything good. My son never called me at night. Not once in all the years he'd worked for the FBI. Not when cases kept him busy. Not when he was traveling. Not even when storms knocked out power across half the county. He respected routines, respected rest, and most of all, he protected me from worry. So when that phone kept ringing, sharp and insistent in the silence, something inside me sank before I even picked it up. Michael. My voice came out rough, thick with sleep and fear. There was no greeting. No hi. Mom. Just breathing. Fast. Controlled. Too loud in the silence. Then his voice cut through the line. Low and urgent in a way I had never heard before. Mom. Turn off every light in the house. Now. For a moment. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Didn't even blink. What? I whispered. Michael, you're scaring me. What's going on? Just do it. He didn't shout often. Not at me. Not at anyone. But this wasn't anger. This was fear. And that frightened me more than anything else. My hand trembled as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The hardwood floor felt colder than usual beneath my feet, as if the house itself had changed while I slept. Every light in the hallway was still on. I had left them glowing earlier that evening, the way I always did, soft. Warm light that made the house feel lived in, safe. Now they looked wrong. Too bright. Too exposed. I stood there frozen for one long second, staring at the nearest switch. Then I reached out. Click. The hallway went dark. Click. The kitchen light disappeared. Click. The living room fell into shadow. One by one. I turned them off until the house was swallowed by darkness so complete it felt like stepping into another world. I stood still in the middle of the hallway, gripping the phone so tightly my fingers ached. Silence filled the space where comfort used to live. Stay away from the windows, Michael whispered now. His voice had dropped lower. Tighter. Controlled. Do not turn anything back on. My throat felt dry. Why? There was a pause. A long one. Too long. Just listen to me. Mom, he said quietly. Please. That word, please, carried more weight than anything else he'd said. Michael didn't beg. Not even when he was younger. Not even when his father died. But now he sounded like a man holding back panic with both hands. Every nerve in my body screamed to stay still. To stay hidden. To obey. But another part of me, the part that had raised him, protected him, survived grief and loneliness and years of quiet nights alone, refused to stay blind in my own home. I moved slowly, placing each step with care. The staircase creaked beneath my weight, louder than it ever had before. Every tiny sound echoed through the darkness like it was betraying me. The air near the attic felt colder, heavier. I climbed the final step and reached the narrow window tucked beneath the roofline, the one that overlooked the front yard and the mailbox at the edge of the driveway. My hand hovered over the curtain. Michael's warning echoed in my mind. Stay away from the windows. But curiosity and no. Instinct pulled stronger. Slowly. Carefully. I lifted the curtain just enough to create a thin crack of space. Outside. The street looked unnaturally still. No passing headlights. No distant engines. Just darkness and silence. Then I saw him. A man standing beside my mailbox. Not wandering. Not hesitating. Focused. He moved with purpose, deliberate. Controlled. Like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. My breath caught in my throat as he crouched low. Not delivering mail. Not checking anything. Placing something inside. A small object, too small to identify from that distance, slipped into the box with careful precision. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it might give me away. Then I noticed something else. A second shadow. farther down the street, standing still, watching the first man, watching my house. The second figure didn't move closer, didn't speak, just lingered in the darkness like a silent witness before slowly fading back into shadow. A faint metallic click echoed through the night. Clear. Sharp. Final. The mailbox closing. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Did you see anything?" Michael whispered urgently through the phone. His voice sounded different now, strained, tense, waiting for confirmation he already expected. "Yes," I breathed. Someone put something in the mailbox." Silence filled the line. Not confusion, not surprise, recognition. "I'm on my way," he said finally. No explanation, no reassurance, just those 4 words. And then he hung up. I lowered the curtain slowly, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely hold the fabric steady. The darkness inside the attic pressed in around me. Every sound suddenly felt sharper, closer, more dangerous. I turned to step away from the window, trying to move quietly, trying not to let fear take over. Then I heard it. Another sound. Not outside. Inside. A faint scraping noise. Metal against wood. Near the front door, my breath stopped completely. I stood frozen in place, listening with every ounce of focus I had left. Waiting. Hoping. Praying. Because in that moment, one terrifying thought settled into my chest like ice. Turning off the lights might not have been enough. Morning came, but it didn't bring relief. The gray light creeping through my curtains felt cold and unwelcome, like it had forced its way into a house that no longer belonged to peace. I hadn't slept, not even for a minute. Every creak of the walls, every gust of wind brushing against the siding had kept my body tense, my ears alert, my heart pounding like something inside me was trying to escape. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the front window. The mailbox stood there at the end of the driveway. Still, silent, waiting. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug, hoping the warmth would steady my shaking fingers. But the bitterness on my tongue only made my stomach twist tighter. Nothing about the morning felt normal. Not the light, not the silence, not the house that suddenly felt unfamiliar to me. Then I heard it. The low rumble of tires pulling into my driveway. My chest tightened immediately. I stood slowly, walking toward the window with hesitation pressing into every step. A black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the house, not the kind neighbors drove. Not the kind that blended in. This one looked official, heavy, purposeful. Michael stepped out first. He didn't look at me right away. Instead, he scanned the yard, his eyes moving across the lawn, the porch, the street, sharp and alert like he was stepping into enemy territory. He wore a dark jacket, his expression tight and focused. All business. A woman stepped out from the passenger side behind him. Tall, confident, her hair pulled back tightly. She moved with controlled precision, holding a small black case in one hand. My stomach sank further. Michael never brought work home. Never. Not like this. I opened the front door before they reached it. "Mom," he said quickly, stepping inside without slowing. No hug, no reassuring smile. Just urgency. "This is Agent Rachel Morgan," he added. She gave me a short nod, calm but serious. "Ma'am?" Her eyes moved across the room, taking everything in, the hallway, the kitchen, the windows, like she was memorizing the space in seconds. Michael didn't waste time. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "We need to check the mailbox." Those words sent a chill straight through my spine. They stepped back outside together, moving with a coordination that made my fear deepen. I stood in the doorway, watching as Agent Rachel slipped on a pair of black gloves from her case before approaching the mailbox. That detail struck me hard. She had brought gloves before even seeing what was inside. They had expected something. Michael opened the mailbox slowly. Careful. Deliberate. Like he was handling something fragile or dangerous. I watched his shoulders stiffen as he reached inside. When he pulled his hand back, He held a small padded envelope. Plain. Unmarked. No stamps. No return address. Nothing that explained how it had gotten there. They carried it inside and placed it carefully on my kitchen table. Agent Rachel cut the seal with a small tool from her case. Her movements precise and practiced. The envelope opened easily. Too easily. Like whoever sealed it never meant to hide what was inside. She tipped it slightly. A small black flash drive slid into her gloved palm. No label? No brand. Just smooth plastic and cold silence. Michael leaned forward immediately, his eyes narrowing. That reaction alone terrified me. He wasn't surprised. He was recognizing something. What is that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither of them answered right away. Instead, Agent Rachel turned the flash drive slowly between her fingers. That symbol, Michael said quietly. I leaned closer. Etched into the surface was a tiny marking. Sharp lines forming a symbol I didn't recognize. What does it mean? I asked. Michael hesitated. Too long. Agent Rachel answered instead, her tone careful. It's been associated with several ongoing investigations. That word hit me like a blow. Investigations. Plural. My kitchen suddenly felt smaller, colder. Michael turned toward me again, his expression tightening further. Mom, he said slowly, have you received anything unusual recently? I frowned. Confusion rising through the fear. No, I don't think so. But even as the words left my mouth, something shifted in my memory. A flicker of recognition. Something recent. Something I had dismissed. I turned toward the kitchen drawer near the sink, my heartbeat quickening with each step. Wait, I murmured. My fingers trembled slightly as I pulled the drawer open and searched through the stack of envelopes I hadn't yet sorted. Bills. Advertisements. Catalogs. Then I saw it. The legal envelope. Thicker than the others. Official looking. I pulled it out slowly. This came last week, I said, placing it on the table. Michael picked it up immediately. Scanning the front. Estate Management Office. Legal Division. His jaw tightened. Agent Rachel leaned in as he opened it carefully. The letter inside rustled softly as he unfolded it. I watched his eyes move across the page. Once, then again. Slower. More carefully. What is it? I asked, dread pooling in my chest. He handed the paper to me. Final Settlement Review. Estate Holdings. Carter Financial Group. My breath caught. That doesn't make sense, I whispered. Everything was settled years ago, after your father died. They told me it was finished. Michael didn't answer. He just stared at the page like it held something far worse than words. Who else has seen this? Agent Rachel asked quietly. Her tone was neutral. Controlled. But I felt the weight behind it. I swallowed hard. Your Uncle Thomas was notified, I said slowly. Linda, too. And Ethan, since he handles some of the financial paperwork. The moment I said Ethan's name, Michael's posture changed. Subtle, but unmistakable. Did any of them contact you about this? He asked. I hesitated, thinking. Then the memory surfaced fully. Yes, I said quietly. Ethan called me 2 days ago. Michael's eyes locked onto mine. What did he ask? He wanted to know if I'd received any legal mail. I answered slowly. He said the firm had reached out to several family members. My stomach twisted. But I hadn't told him about the letter yet. I added. The words settled heavily in the air. Too heavily. Michael exchanged a glance with Agent Rachel. One of those silent conversations professionals have when they already understand what's coming next. Agent Rachel slid the flash drive into a secure laptop she'd taken from her case. The screen lit up, casting pale light across her focused face as encrypted files began loading. Rows of symbols and numbers filled the display. Folders appeared one by one. Strange names. Unfamiliar codes. Then one folder appeared that made my breath stop completely. Carter Holdings. My last name. My husband's company. Michael stared at the screen, his expression hardening in a way I had never seen before. Then he closed the laptop slowly, deliberately. And when he turned toward me again, he didn't look like my son anymore. He looked like an investigator. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy. "We need to talk to the rest of the family." The drive to Thomas's lakeside house felt longer than any trip I had ever taken in my life. No one spoke. Not Michael. Not Agent Rachel. Not me. The silence inside the SUV pressed against my ears until even the sound of the tires rolling over pavement felt too loud. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if he were already bracing for something he didn't want to face. Outside the window, the familiar roads of Raleigh faded into winding stretches of quieter land. Fewer houses, longer driveways, taller trees. The sky hung low and gray, like it was holding back rain. Then Michael's phone buzzed. Just once. He glanced at the screen quickly, his jaw tightening for the briefest second before locking the phone again. He didn't say anything, but the change in his expression told me enough. Something was moving beneath the surface. Something none of us could yet see. When we finally turned into Thomas's long gravel driveway, my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. The lake stretched wide behind the house, its surface perfectly still, too still, reflecting the gray sky like a sheet of cold metal. Thomas's house had always impressed visitors. Large windows, wide porch, carefully trimmed hedges lining the walkway. It looked peaceful, wealthy, secure. Today, it felt like a trap. Michael parked without hesitation. "Stay calm," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "Watch everything. Not listen. Watch." That detail stayed with me. Before we even reached the front steps, the door opened. Linda stood there waiting. Her smile appeared instantly, too fast, too practiced, stretching across her face before any greeting could naturally form. "Helen," she said brightly, stepping aside. "Come in." Behind her, Thomas stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching, not smiling, not welcoming, just observing. That alone made my stomach tighten. Inside, the air felt warmer than outside, but not comforting, heavy, still, as if the house itself had been holding its breath before we arrived. Then I saw Ethan. He sat at the large dining table, laptop already open in front of him, papers neatly arranged beside it, a pen resting perfectly parallel to the edge of the table, prepared, before we even arrived. That detail sent a chill down my spine. They had expected us. Linda stepped closer to me, her voice soft, overly concerned. "How are you holding up?" "Helen." The question felt wrong. Not what happened last night. Not "are you safe?" Just polite concern. Surface-level kindness. "I'm fine," I answered slowly, though nothing inside me felt fine. Michael didn't waste time. "We need to discuss the estate letter," he said, his tone professional. "Clipped?" Thomas remained silent, watching, always watching. Ethan nodded immediately. "Yes. We should also talk about the drive." The room froze. My breath caught halfway in my chest. The drive. I had never mentioned the flash drive to him. Not once. Not to anyone. The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. Michael's eyes sharpened slightly. But he didn't react outwardly. Not yet. Instead, he stepped forward and placed several printed pages on the table. "We found records connected to Carter Holdings," he said calmly. At the mention of my husband's company, something stirred deep inside me. An old memory rising from years I hadn't thought about in a long time. I saw my husband sitting at our kitchen table years ago, late at night, papers spread around him in neat piles, his brow furrowed, his shoulders tense. "If anything ever feels wrong with the accounts," he had said quietly once, barely looking up from his paperwork, "trust your instincts." At the time, I had laughed it off, thought he was being overly cautious. Now that memory returned with sharp edges, I blinked, pulling myself back into the present just as Ethan slid a document across the table toward me. Formal. Printed. Official looking. "Take a look at this," he said. My fingers trembled slightly as I reached forward. Transfer authorization form. Carter Holdings. My name printed clearly across the top. I scanned the page once. Then again. Then I saw it. The signature, supposedly mine. But not mine. Not my handwriting. Not my style. Not even close. My heart began hammering wildly in my chest. "Mom," Michael said quietly, his voice steady but tense. "Did you sign this?" The question felt like a blade pressed against my throat. I swallowed hard. "No." The word landed heavily in the room. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to grow louder. Linda gasped softly, pressing a hand to her chest. "That can't be right. That must be some kind of mistake." But her voice sounded wrong. Too dramatic. Too rehearsed. Her eyes didn't match her tone. Thomas, meanwhile, didn't react at all. Not surprise. Not confusion. Not anger. Just quiet interest. Like he was watching a performance unfold. Ethan avoided my gaze, tapping lightly on his laptop keyboard as if distracted. But his shoulders looked tense. Michael leaned slightly forward. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. Not if... How long... That distinction made my skin crawl. Agent Rachel stepped forward and opened another folder from the documents on the table. More forms. More signatures. All bearing my name. All forged. She flipped through them methodically. "Multiple transactions," she said calmly. "Not just one." My pulse roared in my ears. This isn't possible," I whispered. But the numbers were right there. Clear. Precise. Unavoidable. Michael's expression darkened as he reviewed the pages. Then Rachel paused. Her finger rested on a particular entry. "This one," she said quietly. She rotated the page toward us. A long list of transfers. Amounts that made my stomach twist. Far more money than I had ever imagined touching. Far more than anything I had authorized. Michael stared at the numbers, his face tightening. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. This didn't happen without someone inside helping. Silence swallowed the room whole. I slowly lifted my eyes from the papers and looked around the table. At Thomas. At Linda. At Ethan. Faces I had trusted for decades. Faces I had loved. But in that moment, they no longer felt like family. They felt like strangers. No, worse than strangers. Enemies. We left Thomas's house without answers, but with far more questions than I was ready to carry. No one argued. No one confessed. No one even raised their voice. Yet the silence between us felt louder than any shouting match I had ever witnessed. As Michael guided me back into the SUV, I glanced once over my shoulder at the lake stretching behind the house. The water looked smooth and peaceful, reflecting the gray sky like nothing beneath it could ever move. But I couldn't stop thinking how deep that water was. How many things could be hidden beneath a surface that calm? The drive away felt heavier than the one that brought us there. Michael didn't turn on the radio. Agent Rachel sat quietly in the passenger seat, scrolling through something on her tablet, her brow slightly furrowed. No one spoke. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that I noticed the faint whiteness spreading across his knuckles again. That alone told me something serious had formed in his mind, something he wasn't ready to say yet. "Where are we going?" I asked finally, my voice dry. "Field office," he replied. Just 2 words. No explanation. No comfort. We drove for nearly 30 minutes before the SUV turned into a secured parking lot, surrounded by tall fencing and cameras mounted at every angle. The building itself looked plain from the outside, gray concrete walls, narrow windows, but something about the place radiated authority. This was not a place for comfort. This was a place for truth. Inside, the air felt colder than outside, filled with the low hum of machines and quiet conversations spoken in tones too soft to overhear. Bright fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors, making everything feel clinical, sharp, unforgiving. Agent Rachel led us into a smaller office, closing the door behind us with a firm click that echoed louder than expected. Michael locked it. That detail made my stomach twist. Why lock the door? Rachel placed the flash drive onto the desk and connected it to a secured computer. Multiple monitors lit up instantly, glowing with lines of code and structured data that meant nothing to me, yet clearly meant everything to them. I stood slightly behind them, gripping the back of a chair to steady myself as the first file opened. Rows of numbers filled the screen. Dates, amounts, account numbers. Each line precise, clean, organized, all bearing one horrifying detail: my name. I leaned closer, my chest tightening with every passing second. That can't be right, I whispered. Rachel zoomed in on one entry. Authorization name: Helen Carter. My breath caught. Transaction approved. Funds transferred. Amounts too large for me to even comprehend. My pulse hammered harder as Michael scrolled downward. More entries. More transfers. Dozens. Maybe more. How long? I whispered. Rachel paused, scrolling upward to the earliest record. Her finger rested lightly on the first line. Michael leaned in. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Rachel read aloud. First recorded transfer, 3 weeks after your husband's death. The words hit me like cold water. 3 weeks. 3 weeks after the worst loss of my life. I felt the memory rise instantly, not by choice, but by force. The funeral. The endless flow of people filling the house. Food trays stacked along counters. Sympathy cards covering every available surface. My mind back then had been numb, hollow, focused only on surviving 1 hour at a time. And Linda had stayed beside me constantly. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, barely able to read through tears as documents were placed in front of me. Don't worry about the details, Linda had said gently, her voice calm, reassuring. I'll take care of everything. Just sign where I point. At the time, those words felt like rescue, support, family. Now they felt like something else entirely. Michael tapped lightly against the desk, pulling me back into the present. This transfer happened during the probate period, he said quietly. Rachel nodded, and several others followed within the same year. She opened another file. Locations appeared, access points tied to financial terminals, addresses connected to institutions. Then one line caught Michael's attention. He leaned closer. Zoom that, he said. Rachel enlarged the entry. A financial firm name appeared clearly across the screen. Harper and Lane Financial Services. My stomach tightened. That's Ethan's firm, I said softly. Neither Michael nor Rachel looked surprised. Rachel continued scanning through entries. Several transfers routed through terminals linked to that office, she said calmly. Michael's jaw tightened. We need full access to his system, he muttered. Rachel nodded again, her fingers already moving quickly across the keyboard. But then another line appeared, one that neither of them reacted to immediately, but something about it made my chest tighten. A company name. Unknown. Unfamiliar. Blackridge Solutions, LLC. Is that one of ours? I asked weakly. Michael shook his head slowly. No. Rachel opened the company file. Minimal details appeared. Registered recently. Ownership hidden behind layers of legal protection. A shell company. I didn't fully understand the technical meaning, but I understood enough to know it was bad. Very bad. Rachel continued tracing the connections. Her focus tightening as more data appeared. Meanwhile, Michael stood motionless, staring at the screen as if assembling pieces of a puzzle only he could fully see. Then Rachel paused. There's more, she said. She pulled up another window. Surveillance images appeared. Grainy footage from a nearby street. My street. My stomach dropped instantly. The image showed a vehicle parked several houses down from mine. Dark-colored. Unmarked. Still. Then another image appeared. Same vehicle. Different day. Different time. Still parked nearby. Not just last night. Rachel said quietly. They've been watching your property for days. My chest tightened painfully. This wasn't random, Michael added. No, Rachel agreed. It was planned. She clicked again. Rental records appeared? The vehicle traced to a false identity. Fake documents. Professional setup. Not amateur. Not careless. Deliberate. My breath felt shallow now. Everything was spiraling beyond anything I had imagined. Then Rachel turned slightly in her chair. Her voice quieter this time. There's something else you need to understand, she said. Michael glanced toward me, his expression softer but only slightly. Because these transactions used your identity, Rachel continued carefully, you appear legally responsible. The words felt unreal. Impossible. Responsible, I repeated. My voice cracked. She nodded. On paper, yes. The room tilted slightly. Victim. Target. Now suspect? The roles shifted so quickly I could barely keep up. Michael stepped closer, placing one hand lightly on my shoulder. We know you didn't do this, he said firmly. But his reassurance didn't erase the weight pressing down on my chest. Rachel spoke again. One of these transactions triggered a federal audit weeks ago. My breath caught again. Before last night? She added. Before the mailbox. Before the break-in fear. Before everything. This had been moving long before I even realized danger existed. Rachel typed one final command into the system. The screen flickered. A file opened. Ownership records began appearing. Names partially redacted. Initials visible. Yep. See? Michael leaned forward slowly. His expression hardened. If those initials meant what we feared, then the person sitting at that lakeside table wasn't just family. He was a criminal. Michael didn't wait long after the initials appeared on the screen. We're going to talk to Ethan, he said. His voice steady but carrying an edge I had never heard before. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was calculation. That frightened me more. Within the hour, we were back in the SUV, heading toward Ethan's office downtown. The city looked different that day, sharper, colder, less familiar. Buildings that once seemed professional and respectable now looked like masks hiding secrets. Ethan's firm sat inside a tall glass building that reflected the cloudy sky above it. Everything about the structure screamed success. Polished steel, shining windows, clean lines. It was the kind of place that made clients feel safe handing over their money. Today, it made me feel sick. Michael parked near the entrance, turning slightly toward me before opening the door. Watch his reactions, he said quietly. Not just what he says, I nodded, though my throat felt too tight to speak. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of fresh polish and expensive coffee. A receptionist sat behind a wide marble desk, her posture perfect, her smile automatic. Good afternoon, she said brightly. Her voice sounded too rehearsed. Michael gave her his name calmly. She typed something quickly into her computer, then picked up the phone beside her. Mr. Carter. They're here, she said quietly. Her eyes flicked toward Ethan's office before returning to us. That small movement made my stomach tighten. She had warned him. The office door opened before we were even seated. Ethan stepped out with a polite smile, his expression calm. Controlled, too controlled. Aunt Helen, he said warmly. Michael. His voice carried none of the fear I expected, none of the confusion, only readiness. That alone made my pulse quicken. His office looked immaculate, dark wood desk, sleek computer setup, framed certificates lining the walls. Awards and recognitions filled the space, each one reinforcing his professional reputation. Respectable, trustworthy, successful, or so I had believed. Michael didn't sit. He placed several printed documents onto Ethan's desk instead. We need to talk about these transfers, he said. Straight to the point. No small talk. No courtesy. Ethan leaned forward slightly, scanning the documents with steady eyes. His face remained calm, unnervingly calm. These appear to be internal routing records, he said smoothly. No hesitation. No confusion. Prepared answers. Michael watched him carefully. These accounts route through systems linked to your firm. He continued. Ethan nodded thoughtfully, as if analyzing the problem rather than defending himself. That doesn't necessarily mean involvement, he replied. Financial routing systems process thousands of transactions daily. His tone sounded professional. Logical. Convincing. Too convincing. I found myself doubting my own fear for a moment. Could this really be coincidence? Then Ethan opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Prepared. Waiting. I anticipated questions after receiving the estate notice, he said calmly, sliding the folder across the desk. Michael opened it slowly. Inside were printed logs, explanations, charts, every page carefully organized to support Ethan's innocence. Michael flipped through them silently. Rachel leaned in to review alongside him. Neither spoke, but neither looked convinced. Michael stepped slightly closer to me, lowering his voice just enough so Ethan wouldn't hear. Some of these transactions required legal authorization, he murmured. Not just financial access. Legal authorization. The words echoed in my mind. Not Ethan. Someone else. Someone with authority over documents. A name formed slowly in my thoughts. Linda. The memory came rushing back without warning. Years ago, after my husband died, our kitchen table had been covered in paperwork, contracts, signatures, financial statements. I had barely been able to focus through grief and exhaustion. Linda had sat beside me the entire time. Calm, patient, reassuring. Just sign here. Helen, she had said softly, tapping specific lines with her pen. I've already checked everything. I trusted her completely. She was family. Now that memory felt wrong. Dangerous. Like something I should have questioned long ago. Michael returned to Ethan, closing the folder with deliberate care. We'll need full access to your system records, he said. Ethan nodded calmly. Of course, he replied. Too easy. Too cooperative. That alone made me uneasy. Later that evening, we returned to Thomas's lakeside house again, this time not for conversation, but for access. The family safe sat inside a private office near the back of the house. I had seen it before, but never paid attention to it. Just another piece of furniture in a home full of expensive things. Michael entered the code slowly. The metal door opened with a heavy click that echoed across the room. Inside were stacks of documents, organized neatly in labeled folders. Rachel began sorting carefully. Looking for the original will, Michael said. Minutes passed in tense silence. Folder after folder was opened, reviewed, set aside. Then Rachel paused. Something's wrong, she said. Michael stepped closer. What? She held up an empty slot inside the safe. This section should contain the original signed copy. My heart began racing. What do you mean, should? I whispered. Rachel reached into another folder and removed a document. There's a revised version here, she said. Michael examined it carefully. His expression darkened. What's different? I asked weakly. He placed the pages on the desk, spreading them flat. The dates, he said quietly. They don't match the official timeline. My chest tightened painfully. The signatures. They looked correct at first glance, but something about them felt wrong. Forced. Copied. Not authentic. Rachel pointed to one specific section. Witness signature repeated across multiple amendments, she said. I leaned closer. The name printed clearly beneath the line. Linda Carter. More than once. More than twice. Repeated. Again. And again. The realization struck harder than anything before. Linda hadn't just helped. She had participated. Deliberately. Michael closed the safe slowly. The heavy door shutting with a final metallic echo that felt like the sound of something breaking inside me. I sank into a nearby chair, staring at the documents spread across the desk. Everything felt fragile now. Every memory. Every moment of trust. This wasn't one mistake, Michael said quietly. This was planned. His voice remained calm, but beneath it I heard anger beginning to rise. Rachel flipped through one last document. Changes made years apart, she added. Not random. Years. That word hit deeper than anything else. This hadn't started recently. This had been growing for years while I believed everything was safe. Michael placed 2 signature pages side by side on the desk. Old version. New version. Nearly identical. Except for one thing. The witness line. Linda Carter. Repeated. Verified. Confirmed. My chest tightened painfully as I stared at the names. If Linda helped create those documents, then the woman who comforted me after my husband died might have been planning against me all along. By the time we returned to my house that evening, the sky had turned a heavy shade of gray, the kind that pressed low against the earth as if it were warning of something worse to come. Michael insisted on driving ahead of me, his SUV pulling into the driveway first while I followed behind in Agent Rachel's vehicle. Even from the road, something about the house felt different. Too quiet. Too still. Like it had been waiting. When I stepped out of the car, the air felt thick, damp with the promise of rain. I stared at the front porch, trying to steady my breathing. Then I saw it. The porch light was on. My chest tightened instantly. I turned that off this morning, I whispered. Michael froze mid-step. You're sure? Yes, I said quickly. I always turn it off before leaving. That small detail felt bigger than anything else. Wrong. Out of place. Michael approached the front door slowly, one hand raised slightly as if signaling silence even though no one else was speaking. Every movement he made looked careful now. Controlled. Like he was stepping into danger he already understood. He reached the door handle. Turned it. The door opened. Unlocked. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like my body had forgotten gravity. I locked it, I whispered. Michael didn't answer. He pushed the door open slowly, just enough to peer inside. His posture shifted, alert, cautious, every muscle in his body tightening as he stepped across the threshold. Rachel moved behind him, scanning the corners of the room with quick, practiced glances. I followed carefully, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. The living room appeared untouched. Couch cushions still in place. Throw blanket folded neatly over the armrest. The television remote exactly where I remembered leaving it. But the air felt wrong. Stala. Heavy. Unsettling. Michael stepped farther into the room, his eyes sweeping across every detail. Then he stopped. Mom? He said quietly. I followed his gaze. The picture frame above the side table hung slightly crooked, just a few degrees off center. So small, so easy to overlook. Yet I knew, without doubt, that it had been straight when I left. A chill crawled slowly up my spine. Rachel moved toward the kitchen next. That drawer, she said. It stood open slightly, barely an inch. Enough to notice. Enough to matter. Michael approached carefully, reaching forward and pulling the drawer open the rest of the way. Inside, the space looked disturbingly empty. Folders missing, documents gone. Only loose scraps of paper remained, useless things left behind like trash after someone took what they truly wanted. My breath came out in a shaky whisper. They took them. Michael didn't respond immediately. He scanned the drawer again, confirming what we already knew. Not random, he muttered. Targeted. Rachel stepped closer, picking up a thin folder lying on the floor nearby. It was empty. The label still attached to the front. Carter Holdings. The words made my chest tighten painfully. They hadn't stolen jewelry. They hadn't touched electronics. They had taken paperwork. Information. Truth. This wasn't burglary, Michael said quietly. This was retrieval. The word echoed in my mind. Retrieval. Like they were taking back something that belonged to them. Or hiding something before we could find it. Before I could ask another question, Michael's phone rang sharply in the silence. He answered immediately. Go ahead. Rachel stepped closer to listen. I watched his face shift slowly as he listened, tension spreading across his features, his eyes darkening with every passing second. "What do you mean?" he asked sharply. Silence followed as he listened again. Then he switched the call to speaker. Agent Rachel's voice filled the room from the other end. "There was an attempted login into the federal financial database," she said. Michael's posture stiffened. "From where?" "Credentials linked to Helen Carter," Rachel replied. My heart stopped. "What?" I whispered. Rachel continued speaking calmly. "Professionally, the system flagged the attempt automatically. Someone tried to access restricted financial files using her identity. The words didn't feel real. Didn't feel possible. I don't even know how to access anything like that," I said weakly. Rachel's voice softened slightly. "We know that, but the system only sees credentials." Michael glanced toward me briefly, concern flashing across his face. "When did it happen?" he asked. Rachel answered without hesitation. "Earlier this afternoon." My stomach twisted violently. "That's impossible," I whispered. "We were at Thomas's house." Michael's expression hardened. "That means someone else used her identity while we were gone," he muttered. The weight of that realization settled heavily over the room. Not only had someone entered my home, they had used my name, my access, my life. Rachel spoke again. "This isn't just financial fraud anymore," she said. "She's now listed as part of the investigation." The word investigation rang loudly in my ears. Victim. Suspect. The line between them had disappeared. Michael ended the call slowly, his hand tightening around the phone. "We need more footage," he said quietly. Rachel nodded, already moving toward the laptop she had carried in. Within minutes, nearby security camera footage began playing across the screen. Grainy images appeared, black and white shadows moving across familiar streets. Then my house came into view. The timestamp glowed faintly at the bottom of the frame. My chest tightened painfully as the image showed a figure approaching the front door. Slow, confident, not hesitant, not afraid. The person didn't force the door, didn't break the lock. Instead, they reached into a pocket, pulled out a key, and opened the door like they belonged there. A key. Someone with access. Someone trusted. My breathing turned shallow as Michael zoomed in on the footage. The image sharpened slightly. Still shadowed. Still unclear. But something about the posture felt familiar. The movement. The shape. Too recognizable. Too personal. "Zoom the hand," Michael said quietly. Rachel enlarged the image further. The figure held a small key ring. Attached to it, a charm. Small, distinct, decorative. Something I had seen before. My chest tightened suddenly. That keychain. I remembered it clearly. Linda had gifted identical ones to several family members years ago, a small silver charm shaped like a leaf. My breath caught in my throat. "If that's Linda's keychain," I whispered. No one answered. No one denied it. Michael stared at the screen silently, his expression darkening. And in that moment, one terrifying thought took shape inside my mind. The woman who once comforted me through grief might have been the one who broke into my home. Michael didn't give Linda time to prepare. "We're going now," he said, his voice low but final. There was no argument left in me, no hesitation. Just a heavy knot tightening deeper in my chest as we drove toward Linda's house, under a sky that had turned dark and restless. The first drops of rain struck the windshield halfway there, tapping lightly at first, then harder, like fingers drumming against glass. The storm matched exactly how I felt inside. Unsteady, threatening, ready to break. Linda's house stood at the end of a quiet street, its porch light glowing faintly against the growing darkness. The house looked smaller than I remembered, less impressive than Thomas's property, but somehow more personal, more intimate, which made what we were about to do feel worse. We barely reached the front steps before the door opened. Linda stood there, already waiting. Her face looked pale, her lips pressed tightly together. Her hands clasped in front of her as if she had been standing there for several minutes, maybe longer. "You knew we were coming," Michael said calmly. It wasn't a question. Linda didn't deny it. She stepped aside silently, allowing us inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, familiar scents that once made me feel comforted. Tonight, they only made my stomach twist. Michael wasted no time. He pulled out a printed image from his jacket pocket and placed it on the coffee table between us. Security footage. A shadowed figure standing at my front door, holding a key, holding that keychain. Linda stared at the image. Her hands began to tremble. I watched closely, just like Michael had told me. Not her words. Her reaction. And what I saw wasn't anger, wasn't outrage, wasn't denial. It was fear. Real fear. "Yes," she whispered. The word barely left her mouth. Yes, that was me. The confession hit harder than any accusation could have. My chest tightened painfully, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe at all. "You broke into my house," I whispered, my voice cracking. Tears welled in Linda's eyes, spilling down her cheeks before she even tried to wipe them away. "I didn't have a choice," she said. Michael's voice sharpened instantly. "Everyone has a choice." Linda shook her head desperately. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I didn't do this alone." Silence swallowed the room. Michael leaned forward slightly. "Then who?" he asked. The question hung in the air like thunder waiting to strike. Linda's lips trembled. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Then she spoke the name that shattered everything I thought I knew. "Thomas." The room seemed to tilt. My ears rang loudly as if the world itself had gone quiet. "Thomas." Not Ethan. Not Linda. "Thomas." The one who always spoke with authority. The one who handled family decisions. The one who comforted me after my husband died and told me everything would be taken care of. "No," I whispered automatically. My mind rejected the possibility before logic could catch up. Linda collapsed into the chair across from me, her shoulders shaking violently now. "He made me do it," she said through broken breaths. "He controlled everything, the accounts, the documents, all of it." Michael didn't interrupt. He didn't comfort. He listened. Carefully. Strategically. "When did it start?" he asked. Linda wiped at her face with trembling hands. "Years ago," she whispered. "Before your husband passed, before any of this came to light." Her voice cracked again as she continued. "He created shell companies, small ones at first, moving money in amounts no one would notice." Each word felt heavier than the last. "And Ethan?" Michael asked. "He didn't know everything," Linda said quickly. "Thomas used his firm, but Ethan thought the transfers were legitimate. He believed the paperwork." My heart pounded harder with every sentence. Years. Not months. Not recently. Years. That meant my husband had lived through it. Possibly seen signs. Possibly tried to stop it. A memory forced its way forward without warning. Late nights at the kitchen table. Stacks of paperwork spread across the surface. My husband hunched forward under the dim light, his face tight with worry. "I'm trying to fix something before it gets worse," he had said once. At the time, I assumed it was normal business stress. Now that memory felt like a warning I had ignored. Linda spoke again, her voice trembling. "He suspected something," she whispered. "Your husband, he started asking questions." My chest tightened painfully. "What happened?" I asked quietly. Linda hesitated, then answered. "Thomas intercepted the documents before he could prove anything." That sentence broke something inside me. Not just trust, hope, faith, everything I believed about family. Michael leaned forward slightly. "And the forged signatures?" he asked. Linda nodded slowly. "That was his plan," she said. "He needed someone to blame when everything came out." My breath caught sharply. "Someone vulnerable," she added. Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. "Me?" I whispered. Linda closed her eyes briefly. "Yes." The word landed like a stone. He chose you because you were the legal heir, she continued. Because people would believe the records. Because your name was already connected to everything. Anger began to replace fear inside me. Hot. Sharp. Alive. Michael pulled out his phone slowly. Stay quiet, he instructed. Then he dialed. The line rang once. Twice. Then connected. Thomas answered. Hello. His voice sounded calm. Unbothered. Michael placed the phone on speaker. We know, he said simply. A pause followed. Long. Heavy. Then Thomas spoke again. So you finally figured it out. Not denial. Not anger. Acceptance. Cold and emotionless. You used her, Michael said. Another pause. Then Thomas replied, It was never personal. Those words struck harder than anything else. Never personal. As if betrayal could be reduced to business. As if family meant nothing. Before Michael could respond, the line went dead. Thomas had hung up. Michael immediately checked his phone again. Seconds later, another alert appeared on the screen. His face darkened instantly. What is it? I asked. He exhaled slowly. His phone just went offline, he said. The meaning sank in instantly. Thomas wasn't waiting. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't surrendering. He was running. And that meant this nightmare wasn't over yet. The days after Thomas disappeared felt longer than any days I had lived before. Time didn't move the way it used to. It dragged, crawled, refused to pass. Every morning felt unfinished. Every night felt endless. I slept in short, shallow bursts, waking at every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of wind against the siding, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. My house no longer felt like home. Not yet. Michael arranged temporary surveillance around the property. Unmarked vehicles passed slowly along the street at different hours. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of unfamiliar figures watching from a distance, pretending to be ordinary, pretending not to notice me. But I noticed everything now. Every movement, every shadow, every sound. I realized how fragile safety really was, how quickly it could vanish without warning. Michael checked in constantly, his phone rarely leaving his hand. Each time it rang, my heart jumped before I could stop it. Most of the calls ended the same way. Still nothing. Still no location. Still searching. The waiting became its own kind of torture. Then, one morning, everything changed. Michael received the call just after sunrise. I watched his face shift as he listened. The tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in days. They found him, he said. My breath caught. Where? Out of state, he replied. Small roadside motel. He was using false identification. The words felt unreal, like hearing about someone else's life instead of my own. Relief washed over me. But it came mixed with something else. Fear. Because capture didn't mean the end. It meant the beginning of the truth. Weeks later, I found myself sitting in a courtroom that felt colder than any place I had ever entered. The walls seemed too high, the benches too stiff, the silence too heavy. Everything about the room carried authority, judgment, consequence. Thomas sat at the defense table. For the first time in my life, he didn't look powerful. He looked smaller, but still calm, still controlled. Still distant, like none of this truly mattered to him. That hurt more than anger ever could. Evidence filled the courtroom one piece at a time. Financial records appeared on large screens, forged signatures displayed beside genuine ones. The flash drive retrieved from my mailbox became a central piece of testimony. Its encrypted files now translated into undeniable proof. Transaction timelines stretched across years. Long years. Years when I believed everything was normal. Years when my husband struggled alone. Linda testified. Her voice trembled as she spoke, barely able to meet my eyes. She admitted her role, admitted following Thomas's instructions, admitted fear had kept her silent longer than it should have. I watched her carefully, searching for the woman I once trusted. She was still there, but broken, changed. damaged by her own choices. Ethan testified as well, his voice steadier, but strained. He explained how his firm had unknowingly processed transactions tied to shell companies Thomas created. His reputation, his confidence both visibly shaken. The courtroom grew quieter as the judge reviewed the timeline of events. Each document added another layer. Each record removed another doubt. There was no longer room for denial. No space left for excuses. On the day of the verdict, the silence inside the courtroom felt unbearable. I sat upright, hands clasped tightly in my lap, barely breathing as the judge entered. Thomas remained seated across the room, his posture straight, his expression unchanged. The judge began reading. The words sounded formal, measured, precise. Charges confirmed. Fraud, forgery, identity manipulation. Guilty. The sound of that final word echoed in my mind long after it was spoken. Guilty. Not suspected. Not accused. Proven. A slow wave of relief spread through my body. Not explosive. Not dramatic, but deep and steady. Like finally exhaling after holding my breath for far too long. Then came the second announcement. My name had been cleared. Fully. Officially. Every fraudulent action removed from my legal record. Every accusation reversed. Every stain erased. The weight I had carried inside my chest for weeks finally loosened. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like myself again. Not a suspect. Not a target. Just Helen. Family. However, did not return to normal. Some wounds do not heal overnight. Linda accepted a reduced sentence for cooperating. She left the courtroom without looking back. Her shoulders slumped. Her steps slow. I didn't know if forgiveness would ever fully come, but I knew hatred would only poison what little peace remained. Ethan was cleared of major wrongdoing, but the damage to his confidence remained visible. His once perfect composure had cracks now. Doubt lived behind his eyes. Michael remained steady throughout it all, my anchor in a storm that nearly swallowed me whole. Weeks later, I returned home alone for the first time without fear following me inside. The locks had been replaced, security cameras installed, lights adjusted around the property. Everything looked familiar again, but stronger, safer. Mine? I walked slowly through each room, touching the walls, the furniture, the door frames, reminding myself that this place still belonged to me. That night, I stood in the hallway where everything had started. The light above me glowed softly. For a long moment, I simply stared at the switch. The first time I turned off those lights, it had been out of fear, out of obedience, out of panic. Now, I reached forward calmly, not trembling, not hesitating, just breathing. Click! The hallway darkened. But this time, the darkness didn't feel dangerous. It felt quiet, peaceful, controlled. I stood there in the stillness, listening to the gentle rhythm of my own breathing, feeling something inside me settle at last. Strength doesn't come from avoiding fear. It comes from surviving it, from facing truth, even when truth destroys what you thought you knew, from rebuilding when trust breaks apart, because sometimes the people we trust the most can hurt us in ways we never imagined. And sometimes the only way forward is to face that pain and refuse to let it define us. If you've ever trusted someone who betrayed you, if you've ever faced a moment when truth changed everything in your life, I hope you remember this. You are not alone. There are more people than you think who have walked through darkness and come out stronger on the other side. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you of your own strength, or your own battles, share your thoughts. Tell your story. Your voice matters more than you know. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about family, justice, betrayal, and finding strength again, stay with us. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us we survived.